The United States has operated under a particular framework for decades now, one where its military power exists primarily as a tool of influence beyond its borders, but always with at least the formal appearance of sovereignty respected. What we're witnessing with the discussion of direct U.S. military land strikes inside Mexican territory represents something categorically different, something that should concern anyone paying attention to how empires historically justify their expansion and how international law erodes when powerful nations decide it no longer serves their interests. This isn't just about cartels or border security, as the narrative will certainly frame it. This is about the fundamental restructuring of hemispheric power relations, about Washington signaling that it considers itself exempt from the very rules it spent 70 years building after World War II. When a nation begins justifying unilateral military action on a neighbor's soil without formal consent, without declaration of war, and frames it as routine enforcement, we're watching the normalization of imperial prerogative dressed up in security language. The economic implications alone, the potential disruption of trade relationships worth over $700 billion annually, the destabilization of supply chains that American corporations depend on, the political fracturing this creates across Latin America. These aren't peripheral concerns. They're central to understanding what's actually at stake here and why this moment is far more dangerous than the sanitized policy discussions would have you believe. Let me begin by establishing what we're actually discussing here, because the language surrounding this issue has been deliberately muddied by politicians and media figures who have every interest in making this seem like a reasonable, measured response to a genuine crisis. When we talk about U.S. military land strikes in Mexico, we're not talking about some abstract policy proposal floating around think tanks in Washington. We're talking about the active normalization of a framework where the United States military would conduct operations on Mexican soil, ostensibly to combat drug cartels, without the formal invitation or approval that international law has traditionally required. Now, you might say, well, if Mexico can't handle the cartels, if the violence is spilling over, doesn't the United States have a right to protect itself? And that's exactly the logic that empires have used throughout history to justify intervention, occupation, and the steady erosion of other nations' sovereignty. What makes this particularly insidious is how it's being packaged. It's not being called an invasion. It's not being framed as a violation of the principle of territorial integrity that supposedly governs international relations. Instead, it's being described with sanitized language like targeted operations, surgical strikes, collaborative security measures. But let's be absolutely clear about what this represents structurally. When one nation decides it has the right to conduct military operations inside another nation without that nation's government genuinely consenting, without a formal treaty, without going through the mechanisms that international law provides, what you have is not cooperation. What you have is the assertion of dominance. You have the larger power saying, we will do what we determine is necessary, and your sovereignty exists only to the extent that we choose to recognize it. Now, to understand why this is worse than most people realize, we need to examine the historical precedents and the economic structures that underlie this entire discussion. The relationship between the United States and Mexico has never been one of equals, and I don't mean that as a moral judgment, I mean that as a description of material reality. The United States has roughly 15 times Mexico's GDP. It has a military that outspends Mexico's by orders of magnitude. This disparity creates a relationship where Mexican sovereignty has always existed in a constrained form, where decisions made in Washington about trade policy, about immigration, about drug enforcement, have had profound effects on Mexican society, whether Mexican leadership agreed with those decisions or not. But there's always been a line, however thin, however often violated in practice, that said one nation does not simply send its military into another nation's territory without permission. What we're watching now is the public discussion of crossing that line not as an emergency measure, not as a one-time exception, but as a potentially routine practice. And this should alarm us not just because of what it means for Mexico, but because of what it signals about how the United States understands its role in the world at this moment in history. We're living through a period of significant global realignment. American economic dominance, while still substantial, is not what it was 30 years ago. The unipolar moment that followed the Soviet Union's collapse is ending. We see the rise of China as an economic power. We see efforts by nations across the global south to create alternative financial structures, alternative trading relationships that don't run through Washington and don't require permission from American financial institutions. In this context, the assertion of direct military power in the Western Hemisphere starts to look less like drug policy and more like an attempt to shore up regional dominance at precisely the moment when that dominance is being questioned globally. Let's talk about the economic dimensions more specifically, because this is where the analysis gets particularly revealing. The drug trade that supposedly justifies military intervention exists because of American demand. The United States is the world's largest consumer market for illegal drugs. That's not Mexican policy creating that reality. That's American society, American inequality, American failures in public health and social policy, creating a massive market that cartels exist to serve. Now, standard economic analysis would tell you that if you want to address a market problem, you address the demand side or you address the supply side, or ideally both. But what's fascinating and deeply troubling is that the proposed solution here is almost entirely focused on the supply side, and not even in a comprehensive way, but through military force in another country. This is economics understood through the lens of power, rather than through the lens of actual market dynamics. If the United States were serious about addressing the drug crisis as a social and economic problem, we would be looking at decriminalization, at treatment programs, at addressing the underlying conditions of despair and alienation that drive addiction in the first place. We would be examining how decades of neoliberal policy have destroyed working-class communities, how the financialization of the economy has concentrated wealth to an obscene degree, while leaving tens of millions of Americans in precarious economic situations where drug use becomes a rational response to an irrational situation. But that would require acknowledging the systemic failures of American capitalism. It would require confronting the fact that our economic system produces these outcomes not as accidents, but as features. It's much easier, politically, to externalize the problem, to say the crisis is coming from outside, from foreign cartels, from a failure of Mexican governance, and therefore the solution is to project military power outward, rather than to reform anything fundamental about how our own society operates. And here's where the imperial logic becomes fully visible. When you convince your population that the threat is external, that the problem is over there, rather than being produced by structures right here, you create permission for interventions that would otherwise be understood as violations of international norms. You create a framework where sovereignty becomes conditional, where other nations' territorial integrity is respected only as long as it's convenient for American interests. This is not hypothetical. This is exactly how the United States has operated in Latin America for over a century. The history of American intervention in the region is extensive and well documented. We've overthrown governments, supported coups, trained death squads, all under various justifications that seemed urgent and necessary at the time. The war on drugs itself has been a mechanism for intervention for decades, providing cover for military aid, for training programs, for the presence of American military and intelligence personnel throughout the hemisphere. What's different now is the brazenness. In previous eras, there was at least some pretense of working through international institutions, of respecting the formal sovereignty of other nations even while undermining it in practice. What we're seeing in the current discussion is an increasingly open assertion that American military power can and should be used wherever American policymakers decide it's necessary, regardless of what international law says, regardless of what the affected nation's government wants. And this is being proposed and discussed not by fringe figures, but by mainstream politicians from both major parties. That should tell us something about how deeply militarized American foreign policy has become, how normalized the use of force has become as a first resort rather than a last resort. Now let's consider what this means practically for Mexico and for the broader region. Mexico is a nation of 130 million people. It has a complex economy deeply integrated with the United States through NAFTA and its successor agreement. Mexican factories produce components for American cars, American electronics, countless consumer goods. Agricultural products flow north, manufactured goods flow south. The two economies are intertwined to a degree that makes the relationship far more complicated than simple narratives of drug violence would suggest. If the United States conducts military operations on Mexican soil over the objections of the Mexican government, or even with the reluctant acquiescence of a Mexican government that lacks better options, what happens to that economic relationship? What happens to the political stability that underpins it? We need to understand that cartels exist not despite the Mexican state, but in complex relationship with it. There's corruption, yes, but there's also a reality where cartels have become so powerful, so wealthy, so well armed, that they function almost as parallel states in certain regions. This didn't happen by accident. It happened because American demand created a market worth tens of billions of dollars annually, and that money has flowed into these organizations, giving them resources that rival or exceed what Mexican law enforcement can bring to bear. American military strikes might kill cartel leaders, might disrupt specific operations, but they don't address the fundamental economic logic that creates cartels in the first place. What they do create is instability. They create nationalist backlash. They create situations where the Mexican government looks impotent or complicit, and that undermines the very governance structures that would be necessary for any real long-term solution. And here's what really concerns me from a systemic perspective. Once you normalize this kind of intervention, once you establish the precedent that the United States can conduct military operations in Mexico when it decides it's necessary, where does that logic end? What other problems might be defined as requiring military intervention? What happens when a left-leaning government comes to power in Mexico and starts implementing policies that American corporations don't like? Policies around labor rights, or environmental protection, or nationalization of resources? Does that become a security threat too? The history of American intervention in Latin America suggests that it very well might. We've seen governments overthrown for far less than what's being discussed here. There's also a domestic dimension to this that deserves examination. When a nation is constantly engaged in military operations, when it defines problems in military terms and seeks military solutions, that has effects on the home society. It normalizes militarism. It strengthens the political power of military institutions and defense contractors. It creates bureaucracies and interest groups that have every incentive to perpetuate and expand these operations. The War on Terror has been a perfect example of this dynamic. What began as a response to a specific attack became an open-ended commitment to military operations across multiple continents, costing trillions of dollars, resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths, and ultimately failing to achieve its stated objectives, while succeeding very well at enriching defense contractors and expanding the security state. The proposed military operations in Mexico risk following exactly the same pattern, just in a different theater and with a different justification. What's particularly troubling is how little genuine debate there is about these proposals. The discussion in mainstream media and in Congress largely accepts the premise that military action is a legitimate option and debates only the details of implementation. There's very little questioning of whether this approach makes sense strategically, whether it addresses root causes, whether it respects international law, whether it will actually improve the situation, or simply create new problems. This narrow range of acceptable debate is itself a symptom of how militarized American political culture has become. We've lost the ability, or perhaps the willingness, to imagine non-military solutions to complex problems. Everything becomes a nail because the only tool we're willing to seriously consider is a hammer. So when I say this is worse than you think, I'm not engaging in hyperbole. I'm asking you to think through the implications systematically. I'm asking you to consider what it means when the dominant military power in the world starts openly discussing the routine violation of a neighboring nation's sovereignty. I'm asking you to think about the historical precedents, about how empires justify their expansion, about how international law becomes meaningless when powerful nations decide it no longer serves their interests. I'm asking you to consider the economic structures that create the drug trade in the first place, and why those are never seriously addressed. I'm asking you to think about what this means for Mexico, for Latin America, for the principle that nations have the right to self-determination and territorial integrity. And I'm asking you to think about what this means for American society, for the kind of nation we're becoming when military intervention abroad becomes so normalized that it barely registers as controversial. These are the questions that should be at the center of this debate, but largely aren't, and that absence itself tells us something important about where we are and where we're heading.